If you were to ask any Palestinian who they hate most in the world, most of the answers that you'd get probably wouldn't surprise you. They'd range from Netanyahu, Ben-Gvir to Biden and Trump. But one who might surprise a lot of people is Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas, the leader of the Palestinian Authority, the closest thing that the Palestinian people have to an internationally recognised government since the boycott of Hamas began after their electoral victory in 2006. But when you listen to Zionists and their supporters talking about the Palestinian Authority, this might surprise you. I mean, just watch this clip of Douglas Murray.
Today, Mahmoud Abbas, the leader of the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, is showing total common cause with Hamas in Gaza.
On the subject of the Palestinian Authority, many people outside Israel seem to think that the Palestinian Authority is, as it were, the peaceable wing of Hamas, or is the sort of Sinn Féin to Hamas's IRA. That is not the case. The Palestinian Authority, as well as being a deeply corrupt entity, which I don't need to tell Mr. Barghouti about, he knows well about that, as well as being a deeply corrupt entity, the Palestinian Authority that is funded by the Israelis, as well as the Europeans, the British and the rest of the international community, pays salaries to terrorists. It pays salaries to the people who kill people in Israel. And that is something absolutely impossible to make peace with.
Douglas Murray is lying here. The Palestinian Authority are not supporters of terror, and the experience of Palestinians is indicative of that. Most Palestinians living in the West Bank would refer to the Palestinian Authority as a second occupation or a subcontractor of Israeli apartheid, because whilst it may give money to the families of people who die fighting against the Israeli apartheid regime, the fact is that the Palestinian Authority spends most of its time oppressing Palestinian people, arresting them even for non-violent resistance, and using torture and other horrifying methods to ensure that there is almost no opposition to the Palestinian Authority's rule in the West Bank. I mean, just watch this clip of Keith Dayton, a lieutenant general in the US Army who trained the Palestinian Authority's security forces in the late 2000s, and how he describes the Palestinian security forces he was creating.
And what we have created, and I say this in humility, but what we've created are new men. Listen on. Let me quote you, for example, from an excerpt of the graduation remarks of a senior Palestinian official as he spoke to the assembled troops in Jordan last month. He said, "You men of Palestine have learned here how to provide for the safety and security of the Palestinian people. You have a responsibility to them and to yourselves. You were not sent here to learn how to fight Israel, but you were rather sent here to learn how to keep law and order, respect the right of all of our citizens, and implement the rule of law so that we can live in peace and security with Israel."
Now, collaboration between oppressed groups and their colonizers is not really something that's all that surprising. In fact, the Palestinian Authority is not really an outlier. It dates back to a policy pioneered by the British Empire following a crisis in 3 colonies in the 1850s. Uprisings in Jamaica, Ireland, and India would shake the British Empire to its core, and they would begin to question even the very legitimacy of ruling over other people. And so one of the ways in which they found that they would dominate these restive populations was by allegedly respecting their culture and empowering a local leader, chieftain or ruler because he had some increased legitimacy over the British Empire, and they would then use this person to oppress the indigenous population. And in the case of South Africa, for example, you had what were known as the Bantustan Police, a police force that was drawn predominantly from the oppressed black population but was used to police the Bantustans or homeland where the black people were enclosed. And the Palestinian Authority is little different, because in 1993, the Oslo Accords began, the signing of a historic peace agreement between the Palestinian Liberation Organization and the Israeli government led by Yitzhak Rabin. But the problem was that the Israeli Prime Minister, Yitzhak Rabin, was never interested in giving the Palestinian people a state. He even said this himself. It's not some big secret. Now, the question of why the Palestinian Authority would have ever signed these accords is up for debate. And some people will tell you that the PLO was scared of losing their own legitimacy. The first Palestinian Intifada, an uprising which began in 1987, had led to a crisis in the legitimacy of the Palestinian Authority, because this non-violent resistance that Israel could not get under control was not being led by the Palestinian Liberation Organization or any of the traditional elites in the Palestinian revolutionary movement. Rather, it was being led by predominantly working class and poor Palestinians who lived within refugee camps in the occupied Palestinian territories in both Gaza and the West Bank. This, coupled with Yasser Arafat's decision to support Saddam Hussein during the First Gulf War when Iraq invaded Kuwait, had led to a massive loss of legitimacy across the Arab world. And so some people argue that the Palestinian Liberation Organization, with its back to the wall, made the decision to begin negotiations with the Israeli government so as to preserve their own power and legitimacy. And so the Oslo Accords were signed and the Palestinian Authority was created. But they would never get full rule over even the West Bank. In fact, the Palestinian Authority to this day only has full control over around 18% of the West Bank, known as Area A, where the vast majority of Palestinian cities in the West Bank are. In Area B, which makes up 22% of the West Bank, they only control civilian affairs, with Israel controlling military affairs, and then the rest of the West Bank, known as Area C, over 60% is controlled entirely by Israel. And since the day that the Palestinian Authority was established, it has been a corrupt, undemocratic entity which has done almost nothing for the Palestinian people. But for Israelis, it has actually been fantastic, and this is the funny part of all of their propaganda. They claim that this institution supports terror, but in reality, since it was established, it has been collaborating with Israel in what was called security coordination, where they have shown over and over again that they are willing to torture, kill, and arrest Palestinians that Israel wants them to. And Mahmoud Abbas even referred to security coordination with Israel as sacred. And there's a very famous incident which is frequently used in Israeli propaganda when members of the Palestinian Authority security forces ended up killing 2 Israelis, and this famous photo of a Palestinian with bloody hands was produced. And although this is often taken as an example of how horrifying the Palestinians are, it really is worth contextualizing this, that in the preceding weeks that came before this, Israel had killed over 100 Palestinians, with nearly half of them being children. And in response to all of this, the Palestinian Authority taking up arms, Israel began to wipe away the Palestinian Authority security forces. They inflicted massive destruction through airstrikes, destroyed their infrastructure, arrested many of the members of the Palestinian Authority security forces, and just generally launched a huge crackdown which had humongous effects on the Palestinian Authority, destroying a considerable amount of their wealth and their ability to really do anything. And so after this point, Israel was upset. What they did was they ran to America, and America, along with Western nations, decided that what they would do is they would reform the Palestinian security forces, make them better, perhaps make them less interested in violating the human rights of Palestinians, you might think. No, this is not what America did. Instead, they created a security force which was even more brutal, even worse when it came to human rights, but was even better at protecting Israel from Palestinians. Now, the CIA had been training the General Intelligence Service and the Preventative Security Organization since 1996, and this was codified by the 1998 Wye River Memorandum. However, after 2002, the CIA's role in training the Palestinian Authority increased massively, so as to ensure that there was never an event like the Second Intifada again, and that these security forces, as you heard Keith Dayton say earlier, were new men. And so these Palestinian security forces are now trained at the Police Training Center in Jordan, which has a model refugee camp so they can practice suppressing Palestinians, and they are given training by American private security companies, the Jordanians and the CIA. The people who are recruited cannot have any ties to political groups like Hamas, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, or anything that is not the Fatah party, and this means that there are only members who have family links to Fatah, and also depoliticized youth who aren't really interested in Palestinian politics and just need a job because there isn't really much else to do in the West Bank. So they effectively get all of these young men who are either ideologically committed to what Fatah and the Palestinian Authority are doing, or don't care enough and just want a salary, and therefore they're willing to do anything. And Israel, along with Western donor states, are able to exercise near total control over the Palestinian Authority because it is almost entirely dependent on them for its finances. Because since the Oslo Accords, Israel has been able to collect the taxes of the Palestinian Authority and then send them to them on a monthly basis. However, Israel can freeze this whenever it wants. For example, since October the 7th, Israel has continually frozen funds to the Palestinian Authority that are meant for the Gaza Strip. And what's really important to note is that Israel's finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, is someone who does not hide his hatred of Palestinians, and he is the guy with almost total control over whether taxes are actually given to the Palestinians. And so through this process, the Palestinian Authority is an organization that not only cannot stand on its own, but it's almost entirely benevolent to the state of Israel. And the Palestinian Authority have been instrumental in the crackdown on Hamas in the West Bank between 2007 and 2010. They arrested between 8 and 10,000 people affiliated with Hamas. In 2010, they were dismissing charity organizations, imams whose sermons were too pro-resistance or pro-Hamas. They were doing all of this for Israel. It was undemocratic, it was extrajudicial, but it was done to serve the Israeli state because the Palestinian Authority did not want to have any challenge to their power or anything which could threaten the state of Israel. They arrested teenagers in the 2010s for spraying graffiti, which critiqued the Palestinian Authority for their collaboration with Israel. They spend most of their time breaking up Palestinian demonstrations, arresting children for throwing stones, moving them backwards, and sharing security information with Israel, and carrying out sensitive arrests of political leaders that, if Israel were to do, would cause a bigger backlash. And when you put this into context, you start to see through all of the Israeli propaganda and all of their claims about the Palestinian Authority, and how in reality this organization actually works for the interests of the Israeli state. And yet Israel still doesn't seem to trust the Palestinian Authority. In fact, Israel goes into Area A of the West Bank, where the Palestinian Authority are meant to be in control, so Israel can arrest people there in spite of the fact that the Oslo Accord says that they shouldn't be in those areas. Israel will tell the Palestinian Authority security forces to go inside, to leave the street, and they will humiliate them and carry out their own actions within these areas. And I mean, the level of collaboration between Israel and the Palestinian Authority is genuinely unbelievable. They share security information. Common are back-to-back arrests where someone will be arrested first by the Palestinian Authority, then released and taken back by Israel. Israel controls where the Palestinian Authority security forces will go, how they will respond, whether they're allowed to wear uniform, whether they're allowed to carry guns, whether they're allowed to use flashing lights. And I mean, this amounts to almost total control. And yet still, Israel does not fully trust this entity, because if it were to have its own state, then it could act as a launching pad for the Palestinians to actually have some rights. And Israel couldn't have that happen. They'd rather use the Palestinian Authority as a means to control Palestinian resistance in the West Bank, preventing things like demonstrations. And you cannot even argue that this is just used against violent demonstrations. In 2016, the Palestinian Authority were used to suppress striking teachers in the West Bank. I mean, it is a complete and utter joke that you hear that this organization is somehow affiliated with terror, and it is propagandized as proof that the Palestinians cannot have their own state because they're dangerous and they'll use it to support terror. This is an entity which has done nothing but collaborate with Israel, under the logic that if it just collaborates enough with Israel, then it will be allowed to have its own state. And yet, to this day, it is still not allowed its own state, because Israel is not interested in the two-state solution. And this is why I think it is important that people know about the Palestinian Authority, because the reality is that this organization is not only a force of oppression for the Palestinian people that extends well beyond Mahmoud Abbas specifically, but it is also something which collaborates heavily with Israel. I mean, it has no jurisdiction over foreign citizens, even if they're within Area A of the West Bank. All they can do is detain a criminal and then wait for Israel to come and take that person. So if an Israeli settler commits a crime against a Palestinian within Area A of the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority cannot do anything for them. In fact, what they do most of the time if settlers are attacking Palestinians is they just get in the way and prevent the situation from escalating. They can't arrest someone for a racially motivated hate crime against their own people, and yet you are told that this organization is an evil entity which is involved with terror and must be dealt with, according to people like Douglas Murray. And perhaps the most terrifying part is that the Palestinian Authority is only getting worse. In 2021, they tortured and killed a Palestinian political activist called Nizar Banat. And you might think that I'm trying to hide something by saying that he was a political activist, but he was literally just an outspoken and vocal critic of Mahmoud Abbas and the fact that the guy was not a Democrat. And for that, he was tortured and murdered by this regime, who probably did it at the behest of Israel, by the way, as well. And the most recent event which shows you how horrifying the Palestinian Authority has been their crackdown in the Jenin refugee camp in late 2024 and early 2025. Now, before Israel entered the area and began blowing up massive amounts of buildings, the Palestinian Authority instituted a siege there. They allegedly killed a young female journalist called Shatha Sabah, and they also killed 10 people, including 2 children, in their fight with the Jenin brigades. And after all of this, imposing a siege, killing their own people, they withdrew and let Israel go in to inflict even more horrors. And so what I have tried to do with this video is give you a brief overview of the Palestinian Authority. There are many more problems with this entity and many more crimes that have been committed, but what is very important to keep in mind is that the Palestinian people of the West Bank now face 2 occupations, both the Israeli occupation and the Palestinian Authority, an entity who is not interested in the Palestinian struggle for justice. They hide behind the idea that they prevent chaos and they protect the Palestinian people from groups like Hamas. But the reality is that they are an undemocratic, murderous and torturous regime.